Today's story was written by Reddit user GIJoeVibin. They were hammering on his casket now. Captain Julius could not see them, but he knew exactly what was filling their faces. Terror. Hibernation protocol active, dispensing medicine in 10, 9, 8. The casket's computer announced in a calming voice that really didn't fit the situation. On the small screen in front of his lower pair of eyes, Julius saw a small message informing him that Deck 6 had now flooded completely. He was sure the water would be rising around the ankles of the men outside his casket. It was horrible, but it was all he could do. Their ship was sinking. It could do no other thing. Their engines had been ruined by a lucky human warship, the kind that sailed, not flew, that had fired everything it had at them. They hadn't even been able to make it to their destination, instead crash landing in the mid-ocean, thankfully relatively intact. But when you were a spaceship, sinking into a rather deep ocean, you either let the water in, or you were crushed by the water. Escape pods had gotten a few of the crew out, but most of the passengers, the troops he was bringing to bear on the horrible little island these humans called Britain, they were stuck in here. Those who had chemical hibernation pods enter them. Those who did not were currently outside his casket. 3, 2, 1. The icy cold medicine began pouring into his veins. In not too long, he would fall asleep, into a hibernation so deep he could subsist for a long time on a fraction of energy. It was normally meant to reduce resource usage during long trips in hyperspace, but Julius didn't quite know how well it would cope with a long time submerged in water. But all other options meant certain death. The Imperium was too busy subjugating these primitives to come and rescue several thousand of its soldiers in the middle of the ocean. The humans were also even busier. The Imperium had the technology to rescue them from the depths. It would come once this war was over. All he had to do was wait. The effects of the chemical cocktail was now overwhelming Julius. The screen, sensing the occupant was slipping away, switched off, but before it did, informed him Deck 7 had now flooded. The pounding stopped. Julius couldn't tell if that was the drugs or... Those outside... hang on. Emergency awakening activated for Captain Julius. Cause change in flooding levels. It took Julius a moment to parse out the computer statement, groggy as he was. How long had he been under? A year? 2? He'd broadcast his predicted landing zone before his impact. It shouldn't have taken the Imperium too long to rescue him. That's what this was, clearly. Flooding didn't drain itself at the bottom of the ocean. The screen flashed back to life, but largely devoid of information. Their time underwater had probably seen damage to the internals. Julius had no doubt a few of the hibernation caskets had not made it intact. There were a few things though. A sensor on the casket reported the water levels outside indeed were decreasing. In fact, if he was reading it right, it wasn't even at hip height. Open casket doors, Julius uttered the command phrase, noting how dry his mouth felt. That feeling was replicated everywhere else. His body subsisted on the absolute bare minimum for so long. It was an awful feeling. Being awoken from hibernation, your brain, muscles and organs all suddenly demanding a full supply of every vital resource it had been denied. It was hell on anybody, and the reason a proper reawakening involved a steady flow of food and gradually bring a person up to normal capability. In Julius' case, he would be able to operate barely long enough to reach an emergency cache. The door shuttered for a second before gradually opening up. Water began flowing into the confined space of the casket, but Julius' head was above water, and his vac suit had enough oxygen in it. He staggered out, the water arresting his movement. Even in the pitch black, he could tell it was draining at a decent rate. Every muscle screamed in agony, but Julius pressed on. His legs brushed against something solid, and he knew instinctively exactly what, or rather who, it was. But he put that out of his mind best he could, carrying on and reaching an emergency station. He fumbled at it, pressing the code in. It opened, the contents automatically detecting the low levels of breathable air, and activating an oxygen generator. That was welcome. Julius, running low on muscle memory, located the light switch, activating a small light that finally enabled him to see the state of this section of the ship. There were more bodies than he anticipated. Never mind that, Julius grabbed the emergency food supply, a small hose that is plugged into his vac suit's helmet. He connected it to the necessary port, putting his mouth to the small straw inside his helmet, then sucked at it, filling his stomach with the foul-tasting, nutrient-dense liquid. It was easily the most disgusting thing he had ever tasted, but it would get him back up to normal. The water was continuing to drain, lapping merely at his ankles by the time Julius finished. He watched as it continued to drain away, a small bit of water still locked inside, unable to get past the very base of the door. That was more than enough though. Julius grabbed a small flare from the emergency cabinet, activating it and getting some handheld light. Then he started moving down the line of caskets that marked the rest of his crew, inspecting for any damage. There were dents and smashes in many of them, which he suspected came from those that were now just bodies on the floor. He activated the emergency reactivation systems, punching in a code for each. One by one, those inside each casket stirred back to life, and a short while later, their doors were opening. The inhabitants were in much the same predicament as he had been earlier: desperate hunger and exhaustion. Julius simply directed them to the emergency supplies, heading off to try and collect more information about the state of the vessel. One problem crossed his mind. Why hadn't the Imperium sent in people by now? They had to be surfaced, or the water wouldn't be draining. They should be getting swarmed by Imperium troops now, providing them aid and doing the task of freeing his fellow crew from their caskets for him. Why had they not come in? Julius pressed on to the bridge, a cramped affair like anything else on board. It was completely dry by now, only a few puddles of water visible by the light of his flare. He went to his captain's console, but it was devoid of power. The XO's console, still nothing. How odd, the battery should have lasted for a few years. That also ruled out any chance of seeing the outside world, since like any good spaceship, they lacked windows. "Captain, all the power is out." Exioptries, the aforementioned XO, appeared at the open door. They similarly carried a flare in their hand, raising it high for illumination. "Yes, XO, I am aware. Do we have a head count yet?" Julius asked as he kept moving around the room, inspecting everything. The water had done a lot of damage, which was to be expected, but even with his limited knowledge of the seas, he felt this was far too bad for such a short span. Perhaps there was something especially wrong with this horrible planet's oceans. "More than half of the crew's caskets malfunctioned, sir. No idea how many of our passengers made it, but by some back-of-the-envelope maths, we should still have around 10,000 survivors." 10,000, that was a lot. Less than he would have liked, much less, but still a lot. Julius could, for the first time, pat himself on the back in a non-selfish way. He had done the right thing. "What's the plan, sir? I can't help but notice that our rescuers haven't bothered to welcome us back to service." "Get me a power source so we can trigger the reactivation of the crew. We've probably got all the airlocks open too, so it shouldn't be too hard to get out and meet them once everyone is reactivated." "Yes, sir." Exioptries headed off, probably going to the cargo bay to get a power pack from one of the tanks. If the worst came to the worst, they could probably use a fusion generator intended for one of the deployable bridges. That should easily have survived and provide enough power to get the systems working. Sir? A different voice this time, poking their head around the corner of the bridge. GIJoeVibin did not recognize them, but by the armor undersuit they were a random soldier. What? Sir, you need to see this. The soldier produced a small clockwork device, showing it to GIJoeVibin. It looked vaguely like the sort of thing you would see in a museum. Small hands and cogs were ticking away. This is an heirloom timekeeper, sir. No electrics. Nothing. Been going since we left the anchorage. Probably the only working chronograph on the ship. Everything else has been fried by the water. What's your point? GIJoeVibin snapped out. He had no interest in seeing this stupid soldier's little toy. Sir, the issue is, well, it's not 100% accurate. It will have been thrown off by a few things, but by this, we've been in hibernation for at least 40 galactic standard years. Oh, that can't possibly be right. Sir, I'm rounding down. It could be longer, but I know this has to be the minimum. GIJoeVibin was floored. 40 GSY? The Imperium couldn't possibly leave them stuck down there for that long. It wouldn't dream of it. The Imperium cared for its soldiers. But, oh Krashmila, that would explain the damage. Perhaps the broadcast had been lost in the confusion. Perhaps the humans had taken a bit longer to subjugate than expected. That wouldn't be too surprising. The Imperium had likely just had other priorities first. Yes, of course. This did change GIJoeVibin's calculus though. If he had been out for 40 GSY, then he didn't want to waste another moment in meeting his rescuers. His family would have moved on without him. There would be so many developments in galactic news to catch up on. He didn't need to sit around waiting for everyone to be activated. No, he needed to get out there right now. Wordlessly, GIJoeVibin pushed past the soldier, heading for the nearest airlock. His crews were either waking up, waking others, or attempting to effect repairs. Several appeared to be trying to manually bail the last remaining bits of water from each compartment, starting to fill helmets up with as much as they could. Seeing their commander heading for the airlock, many of them followed, presumably taking that as approval to start dumping it out the sides of the ship. As he got closer to the airlock, GIJoeVibin removed his own helmet, since clearly it was breathable at this point. He took a sniff of it, the salty air of this world's oceans filling his lungs. Before now, he had only ever been to some small lakes and rivers, never getting this close to an ocean. He somewhat liked the smell, and it certainly beat the stale air of his vac suit. Finally, GIJoeVibin and his impromptu entourage reached the airlock corridor. Light was pouring in, finally rendering the flare unnecessary. GIJoeVibin deactivated the flare, stuffing it into a pocket while he approached. The light was near blinding, and he could hear the din of something. He shielded his lower eyes, trying to let them adjust to the light. Behind him, he heard a crewman stumble, spilling their helmet full of water onto the decking. GIJoeVibin paused, his eyes continuing to adjust as best they could. They were clearly moored alongside some sort of large platform. The airlock leading right onto what was presumably a landing pad for a shuttlecraft. As GIJoeVibin stepped out, he glanced around, the design reminding him of a photo he had seen of a human oil rig. Presumably this had been where the refloating effort was launched from. He looked off the platform, seeing huge objects floating in the ocean nearby. At first he couldn't tell what they were, but upon opening his upper eyes, the ones for larger range vision, he recognized them as ships. Not spaceships, no, water-going vessels. Large ones, that would easily dwarf the small pleasure craft that were his sole prior experience with a seagoing craft. Their designs were completely unfamiliar to him, looking like no Imperium vessel he had ever heard of. Not like the Imperium had much use for water-going vessels, of course, but these were strange, angular designs that looked built for war on the seas, rather than the kind of material ferries that were the furthest extent of Imperium naval technology. Each of these ships had a turret with a large main gun of some sort pointing right at him. GIJoeVibin suspected he could recognize the signs of missile launchers all across their hull. Aircraft were everywhere. Again, not ones that he recognized. No, these were mostly helicopters? Was that the right word? An old primitive form of shuttlecraft, incapable of leaving an atmosphere or flying particularly high. The Imperium hadn't used them in centuries. Why were they here? And why did they have so many weapons on them, pointing at the ship? And furthermore, what was that blue flag painted on the side of everything? As a flight of fighter jets passed over at low level, GIJoeVibin got increasingly concerned, but as if to briefly ease his alarm, he spotted a small crowd of figures appearing from one of the doors that led deeper in the platform. The leader was unmistakably a Hecatean, as were several others amongst the group, but there were unmistakably humans amidst them, humans in full battle armour with guns. In those moments, GIJoeVibin's mind raced with potential excuses. They'd been gone for 40 years. The Imperium would have brought the humans to heal. These were just loyal subjects doing their part. The flag? Well, maybe they'd just changed the flag in the intervening years. The boats? That could be, well, maybe High Command had reevaluated some things. The group of figures closed in. Their leader raised and moved their hand in a gesture that GIJoeVibin did not recognize. He suspected it was some sort of human signal. Captain GIJoeVibin, on behalf of the United Nations, I am here to welcome you back to the galaxy. You have been under the water for 45 years and 26 days. There was an outcry of shock from the other soldiers, several of them dropping their helmets. GIJoeVibin couldn't fathom it. The United Nations? That was what the humans had gone by during the war. What was this about, and why was this Hecatean serving them? Why have you betrayed our nation? The Imperium collapsed shortly after your sinking. It is no more. Liar, one of the soldiers yelled, reflexively reaching for their pistol. I can assure you that your pistol does not work anymore. Weapons don't tend to do too well after a few decades in the ocean. Besides, the Hecatean gestured around them, at the armoured soldiers, the warships, and the helicopters. You wouldn't get very far if it did. Now, we reckon there's about 15,000 of you left in there. You are 15,000 soldiers on Earth, the most defended planet in the entire galaxy, decades behind the technological curve. Your odds are not good. As if to accentuate the man's point, something new appeared in the distance. It was a ship, but not a seagoing vessel this time. No, this one was, well, GIJoeVibin supposed it was an airship, one visibly covered in guns. It lazily advanced towards them from out of the clouds, ready to add its weight to the array of firepower currently pointing at GIJoeVibin. Captain, you are a smart enough man to have saved much of your crew. You therefore know there is no choice here. Now, if you come here with me, we can bring you up to speed on just how badly your commanders fucked up. Or, if you're going to insist on having a choice, we can find a different box to put you in for a few decades, except this time you won't get to sleep through it.